I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
And those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
And I'm your other co-host, dependent on Matt Bernico, Dean Detloff.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to be dependent on you because I'm feeling a little bit sick this week. So,
bummer.
I know I'm going to make you pick up the slack for sure. But before I make you pick that slack up off the ground, as I like to do,
I'm ready. I'm rubbing my hands along. I'm ready.
Great. Let's play a quick game to kind of get this episode started. Here's how the game works. I'm going to read you some quotes, and you're going to tell me who said them.
Okay.
You're never going to guess who it is. Okay, here's the first one. Hands off Africa. Stop choking Africa. It's not a mind to be stripped. Pretty radical, I'd say.
Karl Marx.
Could be him. Maybe it's Thomas Sankara. Who knows, man? Okay, here's another one. To all the internal and external organizations that orchestrate war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in order to plunder, scourge, and destabilize the country, you're enriching yourselves through the illegal exploitation of this country's goods and through the brutal sacrifice of innocent victims.
Let's see. I'm going to say Joseph Robinette Biden.
Okay, you're close, I think. Maybe. All right, here's the last one. What causes poverty is not so much the absence of goods and opportunities, but their unequal distribution.
Oh, that's easy. That's Fidel Castro, everybody's favorite Cuban Marxist leader.
Yeah. Dean, you're wrong on all of them, unfortunately. That's Pope Francis, and every single one of those quotes there, that's him. Pretty wild, huh?
Yeah,
you've been duped. You've been tricked.
Pope Francis, who would have known? He's the combination of Karl Marx, Joe Biden, and Fidel Castro all in one.
In some ways, that's kind of right. Not that far off, but it's like unequal parts, right? Like maybe too much Joe Biden.
Yeah. I've never seen him smoke a cigar.
And that's a problem. All right, folks, we are 52 years out from when Gustavo Gutierrez wrote A Theology of Liberation. And the words from Pope Francis that we just read kind of weirdly on this trip to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, demonstrate that development has not quite gotten the so-called developing world very far. In fact, it's bad still. Surprise. The poor are still poor, and the exploited are still exploited. There you go. That's about it right now.
Yeah.
But in this episode, we're going to reflect a little bit more on the theme that we started last week around economic development and how we can distinguish liberation from that particular perspective. As a sort of a different contribution to thinking about, global economics and social movements. So this week, we're going to get into the whole conversation a little bit deeper by introducing a new concept, and that is a concept called dependency theory.
Yeah, dependency theory is maybe the flip side to the conversation we had last week. So if last week we said you got to know something about development to understand liberation theology, you also got to know something about dependency theory, and we did talk a little bit about it and gestured toward it. But we felt like maybe it would be a good idea to spend a little bit more time on it this week, and there's a lot to say about it. It's a huge tradition. It's really fun to learn about. In brief, dependency theory looks for the ways that global economies and national economies, countries, and so on share this kind of interrelated and unequal relationship when it comes to the flows of production and capital. So, for example, the dependency theory would want to show the ways that development in the US and Europe happens at the expense and as a result of the plunder of countries in the global south, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So Pope Francis is kind of, not doing dependency theory exactly, but also not doing it. And that's something we'll talk about. So we'll get deeper into the specifics of dependency theory in a minute, but I think what we want to do in the episode is sort of parse out how that is a pretty radical theory. It has come on maybe some hard times in the last few decades, but I think is still actually very important and worth listening to. We're going to parse out how dependency theory is a radical theory and somehow finds its way into the language of the Catholic Church, even so deeply that you can get somebody like Pope Francis right now in the last couple of weeks in Africa using this kind of language, right? Talking about exploitation, talking about the people who are enriching themselves at the expense of other people, both their labor and their lives, right? Pope Francis is kind of rhetorically giving us sort of like a really morally powerful version of what we find in the drier economic parts of dependency theory.
All right, that's a pretty good place to start. Let's just jump right into the conversation then. So we talked a lot about development last week, and it's about the integration of a particular economy into the global capitalist system, right? How can we make the Congo more plugged into global capitalism so that everybody in the Congo gets the great benefits of capitalism? I'm laughing because there aren't any. No, just kidding. But the idea is that by plugging these quote unquote developing countries into the global economy, that it's going to lift all boats, people get work, the economy grows, and supposedly everything gets better for everybody. But Dean, how does it actually work out?
Right. Well, remember what we were talking about last week with Gutierrez? There's this sort of insistence that if everybody adopts the same models as the global north, then everybody will reach the same kind of level of social improvements as the global north, or at least it's a pathway to better lives than what they have now in the global south. And as Gutierrez was pointing out already in the late 60s, early 70s, that was not really the case in Latin America. And as Matt said earlier, it's been a half a century later, and the Pope is still in Africa saying we got to put a stop to all this. So we talked a little bit, too, about how development starts off with kind of a, it's a weird phrase to say, but a sort of progressive capitalist idea. There's some room to talk about state intervention, public investment, all that kind of stuff. But things slowly get even worse. Like that in itself already was exploitative and not improving the economic situation of people in the global south. But somehow things deteriorate further with neoliberalism in the 80s and so on, right? So ever since Gutierrez made this passionate call for liberation, things have become more and more of a bummer. Dependency theory is interesting because it's sort of the economic way of trying to figure it out. And it has an interesting history parallel to that development story that we were telling. So development, if you might remember, it emerges after the Second World War. And it's this moment where people are trying to figure out, okay, all these countries are kind of newly independent. They're throwing off their colonial chains. And there was this huge war, and the Soviet Union is like kind of courting certain countries. How does the West figure out how to stop that? The solution was we do this kind of international investment in capitalist structures. And what's wild is some of the folks who were tasked with figuring that out, like through the United Nations, came up against some pretty big walls. And from those institutions, from the experience of being people who were part of economic commissions and think tanks and even banking, those folks began to kind of like parse out exactly what are the economic barriers that they were encountering. And I think that is actually a super interesting beginning for dependency theory, that eventually there's a Marxist component and lots of other things going on, but it actually originates in kind of the natural limitations of development itself. So we are going to maybe get into a little bit of that first with the help of a really wild essay that is not my favorite essay in the world, but is worth reading if you can read it kind of critically. It is called Dependency Theory, Marxist Analysis, Liberation Theology. It's by a Jesuit named Arthur McGovern. And it was written for a book that was a celebration of Gustavo Gutierrez's 60th birthday. I guess if you're that great, people write essays for your birthday.
You get a big book. Yeah.
What a great gift. And so it was it's McGovern's contribution to the legacy of Gutierrez is to try to spell out the relevance of dependency theory. And like I said, I think there's parts of the essay I really like and parts I super don't. But we're not going to talk about the parts we don't. It's not about McGovern. We're just going to talk about the parts he gets right. We'll leave it to you to figure out the rest, I guess. You can read the whole book on Archive. The book, what is it called? The book that this is from, Expanding the View. So it's a good book, and you can read lots of other essays about Gutierrez in there. Matt, do you want to get us started here? How can we maybe start the story about dependency theory with these economic commissions and so on?
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's start off right where you just mentioned, right? Right after World War II, and with these interesting, not Marxists, kind of running into weird problems. So this is from McGovern's piece, and he's kind of mapping out where dependency theory comes from and how we can talk about it. I think it's actually pretty helpful, though, because it gives us some more vocabulary to inject into the conversation. In the first decades after World War II, Latin America sought to pattern its development according to this model. That is the model of like modern development, like we've been talking. But one aspect of conventional wisdom soon came under attack by Raúl Prebisch and the United Nations Economic Commission on Latin America, the ECLA, a great and confusing acronym to throw into the mix.
Not Lutherans. That's the important thing if you are a person who goes to church.
I know. Man, did that ever throw me for a loop? Okay. So the ECLA, the United Nations Economic Commission on Latin America, they challenged especially the conventional view that international trade was mutually beneficial for all trading powers. ECLA studies indicated that Latin American countries suffered from short-term instability caused by the fluctuating prices and from long-term deterioration in terms of trade. This resulted, ECLA argued, from Latin America's reliance on export of primary goods like bananas, coffee, minerals, etc., to provide income to finance the buying of imported industrial goods. Far from being mutually beneficial, Latin America continued to run a deficit balance of payments. The, quote, center nations profited and the, quote, peripheral nations suffered. Prebisch and ECLA still retain much of the modernist model for development, but they introduced a framework of analysis that would become an essential part of dependency theory. The division of the capitalist world into the dominant center nations and subordinate peripheral nations, such as those of Latin America. The modern scheme of development that they're talking about in this is suggesting that, to do the work of creating economic growth, of lifting people out of poverty, that whole capitalist narrative, right? The only way that you can do that is by facilitating trade between countries, right? Exports from Latin America and imports of industrial goods from the global north, from the United States and so on. But that's not a fair deal if you think about it, because some of those things cost more and some of those things cost less, and the labor is not equal, and all kinds of other things aren't equal. Maybe we can talk about some of that a little bit more in a minute. But what you have is a center core countries that benefit from that relationship of trade, and the peripheral countries which do not benefit, and that's dependency theory, right? The countries in the periphery, they are dependent on the core for the the imported goods they need, and that kind of creates this unstable situation where their lives become very dependent and hard to do if the core countries suddenly say, the rules are different, tariffs are changing, we're not trading that anymore. They have all the power in the situation.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's interesting that this is all sort of, like I said, originating in, the United Nations Economic Commission, right? Not a radical Marxist cell, but some kind of interesting folks trying to work things out. Prebisch himself was an Argentine economist who did a lot in the economy of Argentina, too. Lots of interesting things to say there. Meanwhile, there's a lot of other dependency theorists trying to work out the precise parts of this relationship. So the big general thing that you got to know about dependency theory is the core and periphery. There are people who prefer different terms or they cash it out a little differently, but that's kind of the operating thesis that most dependency theories work with, that there's a core of the planet, some core countries that sort of absorb the wealth out of the peripheries. So that kind of insight gets worked out differently. People try to spell it out differently, how it happens, maybe how intense it is or what all the causal factors are There's major disagreements about that. We can talk more about that in a minute too. But that's really that key piece, right? Is that people are trying to work in international development in the early mid part of the 20th century, and they're already finding all kinds of like natural problems, right? That you can you can make all these loans to countries in the global south, but there are these long structured relationships that make it hard. The more radical dependency theorists also trace the problems back to colonialism, and they tell a long story about even the kind of differences between like the latifunda, which is like a huge landowning class in Latin America, that system, as compared to like the system in the colonial US. So lots of different things kind of going on. You can really get in the weeds, but the key is to sort of describe that unequal exchange and kind of what's going on. In addition to the ECLA stuff in Latin America, you get versions of dependency theory in other places too. So, like in Africa, for instance, I think we mentioned Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, has been having kind of a renaissance lately, which is good. Samir Amin, he was an Egyptian scholar who also bounced around different economic institutions and tried to figure that out, although he was a Marxist like the whole time, a secret one. There's some other folks like Walden Bello in the Philippines who wrote some really interesting stuff, and he was like imprisoned actually very recently. He's still alive and still active. So like you can find this insight, I guess, popping up in lots of different places. And then there are contemporaries who are pushing it, I think, in some interesting ways. At the Monthly Review that we talk about a lot, they still talk about these kinds of issues a lot. Prabhat and Utsa Patnaik are these really interesting Indian economists who talk a lot about drain from India to the West. I'm just kind of like throwing these names out there, I guess, because it's helpful to get a sense of like the global scope of this insight that like if you're in the global South and you're trying to figure out what to do with your economy, at some point you're going to sort of stumble on the observation that like, man, no matter what we do, all the stuff that we're trying to accomplish keeps getting sucked out. Like all the capital that we raise gets sucked out somehow through debt payments or through multinational value chains or whatever, and we just can't like get a leg up. Like there's some kind of ceiling or like a structural thing holding us down. And I think the fact that that insight comes from these people who are doing like practical economic work is actually like I don't know, just a really fascinating part of dependency theory in general.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, you gave a big list of people who are writing about this. I think that's really good and helpful. I think another place you'll see related types of thought, maybe not exactly the same, right? But resonances is with like people who write about decolonial theory, like Walter Manolo or Santiago Castro Gomez or something. They are very good at recognizing the ways that this is not just like a problem of the 1970s or something. That it didn't just pop up. It didn't just pop up then. But, a lot of these economic problems and these relationships, like globally, are, the inheritance of colonialism.
Yeah, I mean, bringing up the decolonial piece and Magnolo is interesting, too, because they're sort of like maybe the next generation of thinkers after this first and second wave of dependency folks. And one thing that they do that I think is really valuable is to expand the conversation beyond the economic stuff to look at, like, the epistemological consequences of colonization, right? Yeah, like how there's kind of other forms of dependence beyond just the economy. There are some cool like bridge figures there, like Anibal Quijano, who's a really interesting sociologist, or Enrique Dussel, a liberation theologian, and also decolonial theorist. So there's, kind of like you can trace the development of that sort of trajectory in a lot of really creative ways in Latin America. Man, it's great. If you ever really just want to read a bunch of nerd stuff, or like really get in the weeds with theory, there is so much to read coming out of Latin America, especially even now, just squaring all this. But anyway, really neat. So all that to say, dependency theory, this insight that the peripheral nations are dependent on the core, and vice versa, that the core also depends on the peripheral nations for its raw materials and so on, foodstuffs, etc. That insight is something that theologians are reading about. There are kind of like right and left expressions of dependency theory. So, for example, like in Brazil, there was even an attempt to basically govern in such a way that recognized these issues, because Brazil is a huge economy. and so they could make some interesting choices in the mid 20th century. There were dependency theorists like Celso Furtado and Cardozo and some other people who were like in government, basically, calling the shots about development, but they were couped. Cardozo eventually became the president of Brazil later on, and also an incredibly compromising kind of figure. So left and right characters in dependency theory for sure. Some of the left-wing people would be like Andre Gunder Frank, who was a really big one, did a lot of work in Cuba and talking about Marxism. But the liberation theologians are fascinating because they just like read everybody. Like if you read that book we read last week, Gutierrez's Theology of Liberation, all those names I just mentioned are in his bibliography. Like they're just absorbing it all, trying really desperately to figure out like how to have some theological voice that really understands why the poor are poor in Latin America. And I think it's really to their credit, the credit of liberation theologians, to even like, like they certainly have positions. It's not like they don't take stands or kind of gravitate to one side of dependency theory or another, but you get the sense that they're just like willing to listen to anybody who's going to shed some light on the real social realities that they're trying to deal with.
Yeah, for sure. Well, cool. We've got a big sort of genealogy and lots of names and reading suggestions for people on the table, which is great. And I think that's wonderful. But I don't know. Let's see. Let's talk about this for a minute. There's a big economic story happening here with dependency theory, but like, I guess where might people see this type of relationship in the world? Like, people who are living in the core countries, right? Like we are right now benefiting from these relationships. So I don't know, where are some places that people might look to see like the dependency theory in action?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I think it's good to, especially when you're reading this kind of stuff from the core, always be mindful of the position that we're reading from or kind of understanding people from. I remember one time I was talking to my boss, Luke, who occasionally listens to this podcast. So shout out to you, Luke. I'll find out if you listen to this episode or not, I guess. He was telling me the story about this retreat where a particular priest had mentioned that in Canada, we don't need a liberation theology. We actually need a theology of what it means to like be under the pharaoh or be like part of the pharaoh. And I was like, whoa, that's intense and probably true. So lots of important kind of ways of, maybe understanding how close and how distant we are to liberation theology. But when it comes to living in the core, it's actually maybe harder to see these relationships because of things like what Marx would call commodity fetishism, or the way that we're alienated from the stories of stuff around us, right? So like you go to the store, the grocery store or an electronics store, you see a product on the shelf. When you see it, there's nothing there to really tell you how it got to you. I mean, the closest you could get is like the tag on a shirt or like a sticker that says, I don't know, this banana's from Colombia or something like that. On the whole, you don't really have access to the narrative of that thing. And I think that's really important, that it takes like a lot of work from the core to figure it out. And maybe to think of a couple examples. A lot of foodstuffs are really obvious, like coffee and bananas and all the things that we mentioned earlier. That hasn't really changed in 50 years. But I like to think about things like the iPhone in particular. The iPhone is like, if you buy an iPhone, you get a package and it says designed in California, which is the funniest thing in the world because it can't say made or manufactured in California, but they're trying to insist that the real value belongs there, right? The value's in the design. And there's some really interesting work by some Marxist economists, John Smith and Intan Sawandi, on what they call value chains, that looks at all the ways that like the parts of an iPhone are manufactured all over the world in incredibly low wage conditions. And they make their way into the product that is the iPhone, but the value created at many, many different stages of the process of making the parts, making the boxes, all that kind of thing, all that value gets funneled into Apple, right? So it's really fascinating when you kind of break down like how much labor in an iPhone actually goes into making the iPhone and how much profit ultimately ends up in the hands of Apple, which is, a US-based but multinational company. So I think basically you can probably look at anything that you have sitting around your house or apartment at this stage if you live in the global north, And if you start peeling back the layers, you'll find that somewhere the raw materials probably didn't come from anywhere nearby you, and increasingly they're coming from countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, right? Or Bolivia, or places that have huge reserves of things like cobalt and lithium and things that are important for batteries and those kind of consumer goods. So yeah, look around and I guess just start Googling what's in your what's in your room. You'll learn a lot about dependency theory pretty quickly that way.
Yeah, it's true. A few days ago now, there was a picture that got tweeted out that, man, it was so annoying. I cringed when I saw it. It was Joe Biden sticking his head out of the driver's side window of a electric vehicle Hummer.
I did not see that.
Oh my god, I'll send it to you and you'll be mad. Anyways, he was doing it to kind of promote the idea of electric vehicles, and I think also kind of like give some support for the idea that like driving an electric vehicle doesn't mean you have to drive a dumb vehicle. You can still drive this big Hummer that you love as an American. And also in sort of past legislation too, people can get like tax credits for buying electric vehicles, but ironically enough, not that one because it's too expensive. But anyways, I'm bringing up this big dumb Hummer that I do hate right now because the current logic to deal with climate change in the United States is to like wean people off fossil fuels, especially through their personal vehicles, through cars and trucks and whatever, by making electric cars and trucks available to them. And that's very frustrating because that's actually not a very good answer to climate change for a lot of different reasons. At least one of them is that electric vehicles have lithium-ion batteries, and those require cobalt, and cobalt comes from the Congo, where the Pope is, tying this whole thing together. And cobalt is, it's a conflict mineral, man. Like, there's like child labor involved in the mining of cobalt. There's slave labor involved in the mining of cobalt. Countless deaths of people in the mines and so on. And I think it's a great example of dependency theory, right? Because as the core tries to transition to a different type of personal vehicle rather than coming up with a better solution, they're going to do the thing that the Pope said you shouldn't do and strip away all these minerals from the Congo and completely plunder it, right? So it comes up in all those kinds of places, though, as long as you kind of know where to look or think about like where the things that you're buying come from.
Yeah, exactly. And that is the big piece too, right? That the kind of life and the kind of solutions that are put forward in the global north, those are lives and solutions that fundamentally require the literal sacrifice of human beings in the global south, right? Like people who lose their lives or are forced to live in extreme and dire poverty and are food insecure and so on. Those are all economic choices that not that they make, but that the system has made for them, right? And it couldn't be otherwise for those folks. And that is because Joe Biden wants a big electric Hummer, right? There are other ways to do this, other ways to organize our global economies and so on. But the fact that Gutierrez and many other people half a century ago were pointing all this out and we haven't gotten very far, to me, it is a good sort of reminder that what they were saying about a more benevolent capitalism, again, to say a sort of oxymoronic phrase, what they were saying about that is even more relevant now that capitalism has become somehow more violent in many ways. So important to figure that out. I think it's interesting too to maybe pull it back to the theology piece. The reason liberation theologians were reading this stuff is because they really wanted to fundamentally understand like what was the situation for the poor in their midst, the people that they encountered. I think that question about what does it mean for us to read it in the core, for me, it's a bit different, right? It's like, I want to read this material because I actually don't encounter the poor in the global south for the most part, not in any direct way. And if you want to encounter the poor, you have to like go out of your way to do it. And you also have to really go out of your way to sort of figure out the reasons those people are poor, because it's intentionally obscured from your view all the time. It's there's not a lot of companies who make electric cars who are going to be like, yeah, I got this cobalt from the Congo in a mine where people are like doing artisanal mining, and kids have to basically quit school so that they can bring home these minerals to their families and stuff, right? Like, they're not going to tell you that, but that is what's happening. That's the cost. So I think that's also interesting too. Like, very few theologians that I can find myself, and if you find them, please tell me about them. I want to talk to them. But very few theologians that I can find are sort of trying to understand that piece in the global north anymore. It used to be the case that was like a really huge trend, but now it just seems kind of lost. So I think that's my question, even coming out of this conversation, is like, why aren't theologians as invested in this kind of discourse as they might have been, 30 years ago or even 20 years ago? And I don't have a good answer to that question. Some impressions and intuitions, but I really don't know.
They're just not Marxist enough anymore. That's the problem.
Yeah.
We'll get a new wave of them maybe. Now that Marxism is,
yeah.
Maybe we'll see some more of these guys come
That's
out.
right. Yeah, well, maybe we could talk a little bit more about the theological story. Maybe this will be one roundabout way of creating some more impressions about that question I was just asking. So, liberation theology. Some theologians who are trying to figure out dependency theory. We all know the story who listen to this podcast. Liberation theology had a hard time with both civil governments and also ecclesial governments. It ran afoul of dictatorships. It ran afoul also of Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger. Lots of tension, lots of difficult conversations that were sometimes misunderstandings, sometimes just outright discipline, and so on. It's interesting because a lot of those misunderstandings or discipline, and however you prefer to talk about it, I think result from liberation theologians throwing in with this more radical vision, right? That they're really trying to say, look, when we look around, we see this poverty and we want to sort it out. The interesting thing is a lot of bishops in Latin America and other countries too also kind of absorbed this insight. So for example, like, if you look at the documents in Medellin, Colombia, and Puebla, Mexico, that were written by the Latin American bishops, you see explicit reference to liberation as a theme. You see explicit reference to dependency, to imperialism. Like, they use these terms, and they don't suggest a Marxist alternative, but they do suggest an explicit anti-capitalist alternative, and they kind of put forward this vision of the church centered around base communities as like organizing units. And you have this kind of tension that works itself out in the global church as well. The Vatican doesn't really know what to do with this, that like so many bishops in the global south are resonating with that message. To be fair, Gutierrez also had like a direct hand in helping to shape some of that language. But the Vatican is like struggling to kind of sort that out. And I think that is also a really interesting kind of story. All of the sort of development popes in the 20th century, including JP2, I think to their credit, are also trying to figure out why the poor are poor. And over time, even JP2, I think, absorbs some of this more than he would have earlier on. But it's interesting to kind of watch the liberation theologians try to, on the one hand, embrace this really radical social analysis, and then on the other hand, try to like get it mediated up through the Vatican, and with mixed results, I guess, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to see how it starts, in these conversations in Latin America between economics and liberation theology, and then it does work its way up to the point where now there's a pope saying hands off Africa, which I think is pretty rad, but a pretty wild trip.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is really interesting too to see Pope Francis bringing these things together. If you look at his papal encyclicals or the writings that he does, all over the place, he's quoting bishops in the global south. Like, whereas Ratzinger and I guess Pope Benedict, as he was known as the Pope, he tended to be a more academic guy. He's quoting, Nietzsche and poets and whomever else, and that's fine. Like, that's great. I read a lot of those people too, but Pope Francis isn't really quoting those people. He's quoting more popular poets in global south countries, and he's quoting bishops' conferences. Like, it's a way more maybe global citational practice, you might say. And I think what you see in Pope Francis is somebody who is, first of all, from the global south, right? He's the first pope from Latin America. He is coming from a country, Argentina, that was square in the middle of a lot of dependency problems and violence and so on. And now he's on this trip to Africa, first to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and then to South Sudan. And the bishops in Africa have also really found a voice in the last several years. They've released some of the most radical statements. Most recently, they put out a statement to the COP meeting that was in Egypt, basically talking about exploitation and dependency. So Pope Francis, I think, is absorbing basically what the bishops of the global south are still saying, that we're still being exploited. We still we want people to take their hands off of us and so on. And Pope Francis, as a pope from the global south, I think it's really kind of moving and powerful to see him embracing this language in a full way. Like I said, Pope John Paul II actually had some radical things like this to say every now and again, but it's different coming from a pope who's also from the global south.
For real, it is a very potent image. You're right, and a really important one right now to be in the Congo, kind of bearing witness to all these things that are happening. Dean, I'm wondering though. Okay, right now we've been talking a lot about all these great popes, and well, a few great popes.
A classic 90s action film.
Yeah, a few great popes. The tradition of Christians paying attention to development and dependency theory, for sure, right? It's a very Catholic tradition. But I wonder how we would make this make more sense or come alive to people who are Protestants, who are not as Catholic. What do you think?
That's a great question. I mean, there are, I think, a lot of Protestant theologians, too, who are really invested in this conversation. In fact, in the global north, a lot of Protestants were maybe even more directly engaged than Catholic communities because there were politics in the Catholic Church that just weren't as present or operative for the Protestants. So, for example, people like Robert McAfee Brown or Dorothy Zoela or Harvey Cox. Trying to think of some other. There's a bunch that I'm forgetting right now, but there was kind of a whole wave of pretty impressive Protestants writing about all this. And I think they also maybe recognized the freedom that they had as being in a different church tradition and not subject to the same discipline. Like Harvey Cox wrote a famous book about Leonardo Boff's silencing, for example, that it's not that a Catholic couldn't have written it, but maybe, depending on their position, might have had to write it a little more carefully than he would have had to do. So I guess what I'm saying is there are Protestants in the global north who cared, and there are also Protestants in the global south contributing to this too. So Rubem Alves in Brazil, Elsa Tamez, a really amazing feminist theologian, lots of Latin American people kind of engaged. And then, of course, in Africa too, you have a really lively Protestant tradition that's invested in this as well. So yeah, all that to say, I think that Protestants have their own lights that they can find in that conversation too, and examples too of how Protestants have been engaging, I don't know, the experience of Catholic theology, if that makes sense. I don't know. What do you think, Matt? In some ways, I'm always envious of Protestants because they just have less to worry about, maybe, but that could just be a bad perception from the Catholic side.
Well, I think that the Catholic tradition of kind of thinking about economics in this way is pretty cool, and something that Protestants, it'd be great if they. Okay, let me make sure I say this exactly the way I want to. It would be cool if more Protestants in the core, right, in the imperialist core, were able to pick up some of these ideas and think through them a little bit more. Because I think by and large, at least in the United States, Protestants lack this kind of nuance in thinking about economics, for sure, right? It's just not in our history like it is in the Catholic Church. There are all kinds of things that I think really come alive a little bit more when you start thinking about dependency theory and how global economics really impact your life personally, especially if you want to start reading the Bible through that lens, which I know is what Protestants want to do, right? That's the thing that you got to know. Protestants, they want to know how this is going to change the way they think about the Bible or something, or what do the parables mean? What do Jesus' teachings mean when you start thinking about these things? And I guess I'm going to go to a really Catholic place for this answer, but whenever Pope Francis talks about the story of the Good Samaritan, which he does in Fratelli Tutti, and he does it elsewhere too, when Francis tells the story, it kind of has this global tone to it, right? Where there's the Good Samaritan in the sense that you're passing by your neighbor on the road or something, but you get the feeling when Francis tells it that it's about a global community, not just the people who you actually pass on the road or something. All that to say, I think that there's a lot for Protestants to learn from. I think the the tradition of Catholic social thought around economics, especially in this particular register, and how it's grown kind of to be a part of the church tradition.
I think that's right. And I think too, like, one thing that I find really fascinating about the Protestant church, but Catholics too, is there is a huge divide between what the church does institutionally and what people in the pew know or understand about it. And the reason I'm saying that is, like, I work for a Catholic development organization, and we're like constantly trying to make sure that Catholics know that we exist and like try to convince them that like we are here and we are part of the church and what a cool thing that is, and you should be into it because you're Catholic, right? And like that is a very challenging but very interesting and rewarding job to have, to try to communicate that. In the Protestant churches in Canada, at least, and I know in the US they have analogous things, many of them also have really strong development like ministries or branches, or I don't know what they would call them, but like the Anglicans, they have a World Development Fund, for example. The United Church of Canada, I mean, how many times have we brought Jim Hodgson on this podcast to like talk to us about the Global South, right? Like they have this really robust solidarity development model too. And I find like there's this really lively tradition in the Protestant churches, the mainline churches especially, institutionally. Like they've really absorbed, I think, a lot of this stuff. But I feel like I've never met a Protestant who's just like a normal person going to church who knows that that is going on. Like knows that the money that they put in the plate is like, going to some staff person who like knows a thing or two about dependency theory and Gustavo Gutierrez and is like taking a trip to Cuba to talk to people about it, right? Like there's some kind of disconnect that happens there, and maybe for the better, I don't really know, but it seems like there's kind of a great ignorance there. Like I'm always asking people like, oh, what do you know about what your church does for development? Just because that's what I'm in. And yeah, it seems like there's some kind of disconnect.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I don't know. What does the Episcopal Church do for development?
Yeah, I mean, there's like a development fund as well, but I don't think it's quite as robust theoretically as the Catholic tradition. But maybe I don't know what I'm talking about as well. Who knows? I would be happy to be proven wrong, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a handful of listeners for sure who are, I'm sure, yelling at their dishes.
Yeah, maybe they know. Tell us, please.
Yeah, please do. But I think it's a good question, though, right? Like, I mean, the Catholic tradition has its own way of getting into it, but it carries these liabilities, and Protestants maybe have some unique opportunities to take it on board and take it somewhere else and deepen it. Maybe the other thing, though, that this connects with is, I said earlier, dependency theory is kind of like fallen on bad times or hard times. Maybe it's worth kind of getting toward the end of the conversation on that note, because I was complaining that theologians aren't reading this stuff anymore, but maybe this will be like the pitch for it. So dependency theory, it was booming in the 70s and 80s especially. It started to wane, I think, after that for a lot of reasons, for the same reasons that most progressive things started to wane toward the end of the 80s into the 90s, right? The Soviet Union fell, neoliberalism kind of took everything over. There was a major collapse of organizing, a lot of confusion. And dependency theory also, I think, gets sort of looked at as like a... I don't know how to put it, like a uniquely 20th century phenomenon. Like it tells, sometimes people say this, I think they're wrong. People say that dependency theorists tell stories that are too big about the economy, that they're not like finely detailed enough. I think if you read dependency theory on its own terms, you'll find that's not true. But that's what people say. That's the impression. People also say that dependency theory has been kind of replaced by some of the figures Matt mentioned earlier, like Magnolo and these more decolonial theorists, even though those decolonial theorists themselves are often making reference to dependency theory. I think there's just sort of a sense that it like has passed its prime, or, there's been too many changes in the market and it doesn't really understand the complexity of global flows and all the rest of it. And I want to say, I think that is bogus. I think there's important debates to be had about global economy. I don't think dependency theory is like the only theory on the block that has anything worth paying attention to. Like there's lots of other stuff happening and lots of other theories of imperialism even, and it's good to read them all. But I think that people have really prematurely written dependency theory off. And I think because theologically speaking, it is, I think, like arguably the most significant political economy body of literature that theologians have read in the last like 60 years. I think it's probably worth people picking it up again and like seeing how far it gets, right? Like people are still writing about it. The Monthly Review is still carrying on that tradition in its own way, and they publish all kinds of books that have to do with it. Like I said, Walden Bello just was imprisoned in the Philippines. Lots of kind of folks are still pushing that forward, but I do think that it takes like maybe some work to figure out how theology absorbs it. I don't know. What do you think, Matt? Why should Christians care about dependency theory right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard not to care about it from my perspective, at least. You know, to me, this is really close to the imperial mode of living conversation that we were having not too long ago, right? I think that dependency theory is important for us because our lives are actively benefiting from other people's suffering. And I don't know, that should just not sit well with people. But it's a hard thing to cultivate a particular type of consciousness around because it is so mundane and kind of just ingrained in the way that we live. But I don't know, that's what does it for me, right? People are suffering because I have a new iPhone or something, because I am constantly buying new things that have lithium-ion batteries in them. And I think that's an important part of the conversation, right? How do we respond ethically, or even like the bigger picture question? Like this is, I guess, trying to bring it back around to Joe Biden driving the Hummer. If we want a green economy, or whatever we want to call it, in the coming years, if we want to make sure that we don't all boil to death on this planet, we have to figure this into our strategy and into the ways that leftist social movements, Christian or not, make demands of our government and other people in power. Right? Like we can't just say we want a Green New Deal, because that misses all of the ways people in the global south will still be kind of caught up in the machinations of global capitalism, and their lives will be limited because of it. I think there's all kinds of reasons of why people should care about this particular type of theory. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think, Dean?
Yeah, I think that you are right, as always. I also think it's interesting because for me, what I found so useful about it is it does give you a sense of the scale of the problem of global capitalism, and it is truly global. Like, we all have to go on strike. We all have to go build the labor movement. It's all very important in our own countries and so on. But at the end of the day, like, the global economy is so interlinked, so intertwined, that it's going to take, like, a lot of work and a lot of challenging global kinds of shifts that will be really difficult to manage, and will likely be fraught with tension and lots of big problems. It's going to take a lot of change to create some other kind of order. Yeah. And like, that is a troubling thing in some ways. But I think it's also helpful to be like, I can kind of make sense of why some of these tensions are emerging geopolitically, between China and Russia, and I mean, lots of other places, and who knows what's going to happen in Latin America, right? There's a lot at stake as the sort of order that failed, the developmentalist order that failed, is cracking apart, breaking apart. And not always for the better in every situation either, like in complicated ways. And I think that is going to be challenging. But dependency theory and kind of the people who kept thinking with it are trying to think through, like, what are ways to rebuild it? What's the systematic way of kind of doing something different? For example, like Andre Gunder Frank, he was the dependency theorist who was on the more Marxist side, and like, he was pretty unequivocal. He was like, Cuba got it right. You have to really assert your own sovereignty. You've got to de-link. Not to say that you don't trade with other folks, but like, you got to do it on your own terms, and that was like a pretty radical suggestion. Not every dependency theorist was into it, but it seems pretty right to me. Or, like Samir Amin, this great Egyptian economist, a similar kind of thing, that he thought there needed to be a delinking of the global south from the global north, and then a kind of like south-south trade alliance, basically, to sort of figure out, other terms of development. So I think there's like a lot of stuff going on. And also, dependency theory is great because it gives you both the revolutionary side, but it also gives you people who are like in the weeds of really boring economics, right? Like looking at trade deals, looking at like how to create economic relationships. And to me anyway, that's like I don't know, kind of like comforting to know that you actually don't just have to throw up your hands and be like, well, I guess there just has to be a revolution and nothing will change until that happens. Like there's some other steps in between maybe, and it's one body of literature that's trying to parse that out. I don't know if that makes any sense. I guess I just feel like there's explanatory power there, and I feel empowered that someone explained it to me. That's why I feel grateful about it.
Yeah, well, let's close up the conversation then and like turn back to Gutierrez for a minute, right? So we said it's been 52 years since Gutierrez wrote A Theology of Liberation. Knowing that fact is both depressing and I guess a little bit liberating. But thinking back, to the conversation we had last week, where Gutierrez explains that this purely economic development is not going to work, right? He said that 52 years ago, and it's still true. Pope Francis is telling us it's true even today in the Congo, right? Like he's pointing to it directly. He's waving his hands around and saying, "Look at this whole place. You got to think about it." But Gutierrez's response though to development is not development. It's liberation, right? It's about putting like the oppressed people in the driver's seat for their own economic development in their own lives, and not relying on global banks to sort things out for them. So I don't know. To me, Gutierrez is still right. He's right. Development is always going to kind of put us in this place. It's always going to make so-called developing countries dependent on the core. And instead, I think we have to work from this other perspective, right, about liberation rather than economic growth along these like normal capitalist lines or whatever.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. You can follow us on Twitter at the Magnificast. If you support us at $2 at the Patreon, you can also join a great Discord community that we have. Lots of good conversations going on there lately. Some wild books that I'm learning about, some great memes, a lot of good animal content lately. Feel like that's been a really strong sort of channel. Appreciate that. So you can do that at $2 or more. Let's see, what else do I need to say? Our music is by Maria Armstrong. Our outro is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have